Nikon Zf firmware seemingly out of nowhere, packed full of updates, bringing ZF up to date. Now what about those auto-focusing nerds? Did they bring auto detection for birds? G'day everybody, how are you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope you are super well. The ZF major firmware update 2.0. The ZF has had two updates since it was launched in September of 2023, approximately 18 months ago, but this is a major update that brings quite a number of features. First cab off the rank is Imaging Cloud, which gives us the ability for our camera to automatically upload images to the cloud once we are on a Wi-Fi network. Now, Nikon allows you to have it on their servers for 30 days for free, and then it can go from their servers to services like Dropbox or Google Drive, etc. This is a great tool, and what this means is no cables, and you don't have to remove your cards from your camera ever. Now, something that's interesting about the ZF is, of course, it has two card slots. One of them is a micro SD. Of course, they are tiny cards. This just allows you to never have to take either of your SD or micro SD cards out of the camera, never risking losing them. And the only time that you ever might have to do that is if you ever have to replace them. Along with uploading your images to the cloud, we also get access to the imaging recipes. And that is lots of different creative styles. Now, this is something that some people love, and I'm sure some people are not interested in at all because they create their own or they do it in post. Now, this service allows you to not only download Nikon's picture controls, but also picture controls made by third parties. Very exciting. And the final part of Imaging Cloud is the ability to update firmware, again, simply by connecting to a Wi-Fi network. No need to remove cards, upload cards, put firmware on cards, reinstall cards. You don't have to do any of that. You can simply do it via the cloud. And this is something that I know, as you would have seen in my intro, that a lot of people that love autofocus for wildlife and love autofocus for birding. Yes, we now have a dedicated birding mode. It has been stated by Nikon that this dedicated mode means that you will get faster acquisition of birds. It does also mean that it will work on smaller birds, different body shapes of birds, as well as birds in more difficult background situations. Now, I'm going to talk further about this in regards to the Z6III at the end of this video. Dedicated bird detect has now been added to the ZF, and that is very exciting for birders. For video users, we now have high-res zoom. If you are shooting in an HD resolution, which is 1920 by 1080, you can 2 times zoom that image, basically extending your lens by 100%. Effectively, a 50mm lens becomes a 100mm field of view equivalent. Now, you can't do this in 4K because how the camera does this is to digitally zoom that 4K sensor by using a resolution that's half the size. It's good stuff, it works well, and it is now being rolled out, I think, to pretty much every XP7 camera we now have. Also on the video front has been added usability for the new PZ 28-135 f4 lens. Check out my review here. For those that love using manual lenses, we now have a 400% magnification when you're trying to get critical focus. This is the way that I choose to focus manual lenses. I don't use focus peaking because I think the results there can be a little variable. Whereas focus magnification, it is WYSIWYG. In other words, we are actually seeing what we are getting. And so I'm pretty excited about getting that 400% addition. Previously, it was 200%. Also, when talking about manual lenses, we now have, like many of the other XP7 cameras, the ability to put in more details when we are using non-CPU lenses. That includes naming the lens as well as precise control over the focal length and aperture. In the past, there were just options you could choose, but it didn't cover everything. Now you can literally dial in what your lens is. Now, if you're somebody that uses a tripod and shoots at night, which I do sometimes, and you don't want a shutter release cable or a remote control with you, one way to do that is with exposure delay mode, being able to go from, I think, 0.5 of a second all the way up to 3 seconds. That gives you time to take your hand off the camera and for any slight movement that is occurring to settle. Again, this is a really useful feature if you forget a shutter release cable or a remote control. And we can now reassign the command dials to control ISO and exposure compensation instead of using the dials on top. This works in manual mode. This is a major update, which is fantastic to see 18 months after the ZF was originally launched, bringing a great deal of features that we have seen roll out in that time. Now, interestingly, the Z8 and the ZF came out in the same year. That's 2023. And both of them have had bird detect added after the fact. A major firmware update for the Z8, Firmware 2.0, early in 2024. And now a year later, early in 2025, we are getting bird detect added to the ZF. Now, what this says to me is at the time that Nikon was working on the whole idea of bird-specific detect, some models, unlike the cameras that we see today, simply missed the boat. Their firmware was being developed and or finalized before Nikon had finalized bird detect as a whole. Now, of course, we see with the new Z50 and the Z5 that both of those cameras have arrived with bird detect. And that's because they are significantly later in the development cycle. Something like a year and a half from around the time that Nikon was working to bring bird dedicated detection across the XP7 range. Now, of course, people have asked what's going on with the Z6III. Well, from my perspective, it sits in exactly the same category as the Z8 and the ZF. It's a camera that its firmware development cycle began before Nikon was working specifically on bird detect. Z8, firmware 2.0. ZF, firmware 2.0. And could it be that we get Z6III, firmware 2.0 that includes bird detect? There's certainly a pattern forming here, and we can certainly see that it took a while to arrive with the Z8, and it took even longer to arrive with the ZF. We don't know and we don't understand the differences between these cameras, but what we can say is with the Z5 and with the ZF, they are 24 megapixel sensors. Perhaps Nikon is now at the point where they have written the code to work on that sensor size. And beyond that, we don't really know what makes these cameras tick. But what we can say is that all the full frame 24 megapixel cameras are now starting to get dedicated bird detection. Does that mean the Z6III is not too far away? And I would put even odds that it's coming and it won't be as long as it's been for the ZF since its launch, 18 months. And thus, if it's another 12 months at worst, that wouldn't be such a big deal. But I'm going to guess it's going to be something like 6 to 9 months if it's going to happen. And a week ago, there was no bird detect in the ZF, but now there is. From my perspective, that increases the odds significantly of it arriving in the Z6III. It's just a matter of time. If people would like me to put together a video specifically explaining the idea of firmware branching off, in other words, you've kind of got your base code, and then as a camera is coming close to market, and when I say close to market, that might be something like 2 years before we actually see it. Of course, firmware needs to be written specifically for each camera because they do have differences. And then early working models may well be in operatives' hands something like 6 to 9 months before we even see it. And then NDA copies might be something like 3 months before they actually ship. So firmware is branched off, I would guess, perhaps even as long as 2 years before the cameras actually ship. And that's why Bird Detect, which was being developed in a specific window, missed the ZF, the Z8, and the Z6III, because all of those cameras' firmware were branched off. They were diverted before Bird Detect was a common or standard part of the XP7 firmware. And what that means is then Nikon's got to go back to that firmware because Bird Detect was never there in the first place, and they've got to add it back in. Now, of course, you might think it's as simple as a copy and paste, but I guarantee you it's not. And then, of course, it has to be robustly tested. And I suspect that takes a while as well. And let's not forget, if it is robustly tested and they do find a problem, they've got to go back and fix it and then test it all again. Firmware is not an easy thing. And of course, you don't want people's cameras not working in a critical moment. So yes, the arrival of Bird Detect in the ZF, from my perspective, raises the possibility of it arriving in the Z6III significantly. I do look forward to it arriving soon when, of course, Nikon has the time to integrate Bird Detect into the Z6III firmware, which, again, I will reiterate, it probably branched off from the base code perhaps somewhere between 1 and 2 years from when we saw it being launched.
And just before you jump out of this video, I also want to point out that I've just talked about a few of the highlights, but there are actually way more updates to this camera, and also there are bug fixes. So if you own a ZF, please do update your camera, and please do check out this long list of changes between the previous firmware and 2.00.
All right, everybody. Well, it's been so good to see you. And please do let me know in the comments below, what do you think of the ZF? Do you have a ZF? What color is your favorite ZF? Oh my goodness, what a great camera that just got even better. And if this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. All right, bye for now. Nikon just dropped firmware completely out of nowhere.